What's up? This is Megan Kopp with Rockstart Wellness. I am a certified holistic health coach coming at you with part 2 of the Rockstart Wellness Nutrition 101 webinar. This part of the webinar is going to cover our totally screwed up food system, how it got that way and why it's staying that way, the toxicity of our current food supply, and how there is a better way. For those of you who caught part 1 of the webinar, you've got a pretty basic idea for the nutritional aspects of our diet, the macronutrients that you need, the proteins, the fats, the carbohydrates, things like that, and also the micronutrients, which are your vitamins and your minerals. Now, if you haven't seen that part of the webinar, go back and check it out. It's got a lot of really great information in it. But if you're not so much interested in that as you are interested in how the way things got the way that they are, this is the absolute place to be. Now, I want to give you just a little bit of disclosure. Most of the information that I'm going to present here today is based on fact. It's totally true. You can look it up if you don't believe me. Some of it is a little bit of my own personal conjecture, my own personal beliefs, and based on my own experiences. And when that comes up, I will, of course, let you know. But other than that, this is pretty much based on fact. So if you have any questions, or if you find anything that's a little, doesn't quite seem right that I presented here today, of course, and anything you loved about the seminar, put it in the comments below. I love feedback. It's going to help me grow and become a better health coach for my clients, which maybe someday would be you, which would be totally awesome. So on we go, and I want to apologize for a little bit of my technical ineptitude. I'm still kind of getting used to this whole Hangouts on Air thing, so forgive me if I mess anything up, but I think I've got the hang of it. So I'm going to switch over to the screen share mode right now and pop on over to, all right, here we go. All right, our effed up food system. I'm going to start with a little bit of history, especially the impact of the Industrial Revolution and how it affected our current food system, and how a lot of the practices that we put into place from the beginning to the middle of the 20th century are still happening today. I'm going to talk about so-called scientific progress. Now, scientific progress is awesome, but in the ways that this progress has impacted the food system has not been very good for our health or for our economy, and I'll get more into that as well. Going to cover the Ancel Keys 7 countries study, which is responsible for the whole low-fat craze that happened between the mid-70s and all the way up into the early part of the 21st century, and why that came about. Touch a little bit on American history in regards to the counterculture and the women's liberation movement, and how that affected our food supply and how we now cook and eat in our homes and outside of our homes. I'm going to talk a little bit about government intervention as far as nutritional guidelines, as well as the evolution of the food pyramid into its current incarnation as MyPlate. And of course, talk about government subsidization of crops that are grown in America, how that affects our economy, how it has affected our food supply, and even more importantly, how it's affected our political system in regards to how we eat. So, the Industrial Revolution took place in the very late part of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century. A lot of factories were being built, a lot of technology was being created, things like assembly lines, a lot of mechanized reproduction facilities were going up everywhere, but this was happening in the cities. And up until that point, most people lived in the country. They lived out on farms, they lived in villages and things like that. The Industrial Revolution brought people out of the country, moving them from an agrarian life to urban life. So now we've got these gigantic cities, a lot of people living in them, packed on top of each other, and fresh food was a lot harder to come by because it was far away from the cities. It had to be brought in. But by the time it got there, it was largely contaminated or spoiled because there wasn't any kind of refrigeration, and the preservation methods that were used before refrigeration and freezing and canning and things like that weren't necessarily unreliable. There was no reason to preserve food that heavily up until now. So we've got all these growing populations in these gigantic cities, which are just bursting at the seams, and they're getting bigger and bigger, and there's more and more of them. And all these people need to be fed, but how are we going to feed them? How are we going to bring the food from the country into the city and make sure that it's still good by the time it gets there. Well, a lot of preservation, a lot of food dyes and pesticides, canned and frozen foods came through thanks to scientific breakthroughs that happened mostly during World War I and World War II. Now, these two specific wars made it necessary for us to get food to soldiers fighting overseas. So there had to be some way of making sure that these foods stayed fresh and edible, if not fresh, at least edible and not contaminated by the time that they reached our soldiers. So a lot of scientific research was being done during those times to make sure that these soldiers got good, fresh food. Later on down the line, technology introduced the concept of GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And if you haven't heard about that, well, you're living under a rock. In addition to the two world wars, there was a lot of scarcity, especially during the Great Depression, when the economy completely collapsed in the United States for a stretch of time. And then again during World War II, when we were allocating a lot of our foodstuffs to the war effort, the scarcity justified the use of chemical preservatives and artificial sweeteners in the food supply for the people staying here at home, because we were using so much of the food supply to take care of our soldiers that there wasn't a whole lot left. If you've ever heard of Victory Gardens, that was born during World War II. The government encouraged people to grow their own food in their yards so that they were able to eat, so that the food supply, the industrial food supply, could be used to feed our soldiers. Out of this grew the concepts of single crop farming and factory farming, which is what we're still using largely today. And those methods further justify the use of pesticides and herbicides. But unfortunately, these practices also strip nutrients from the soil, which justify the use of chemical fertilizers. Now, before we were using all these chemicals, farmers enriched the soil through things like crop rotation, through biodynamic farming, and just by letting the soil breathe every once in a while. They were natural, they were organic, they'd been practiced for hundreds and thousands of years, and then suddenly we had all this scientific stuff and all these chemicals, and they said, well, hey, these are cheaper, we can make them easier, and we've got a ton of them, so let's just use them. Unfortunately, this means that all the nutrients were totally stripped from the soil and then from the food, and then we sent them off to process even further, which strips them of even more nutrients. And now we're justifying artificial fortification of these foods, meaning that the nutrients that were stripped during farming and processing are now added back to the foodstuffs artificially, chemically. So if you're starting to pick up on what I'm putting down here, we're putting a lot of chemicals into our food supply just because the practices that we're using are stripping the nutrients from our food supply. This doesn't make sense. And there's a farmer in, I believe it's Virginia, his name's Joel Salatin. He wrote a book about this called Folks, This Ain't Normal. It's a fantastic read. I encourage everybody to get that book, read it, and it will shine so much light on the current state of our food system and why it's not normal. On top of all of these chemicals that we're using in our farming practices and in our preservation and processing practices, we have things like refrigerators, freezers, and microwaves that have become standard home appliances. This began around the mid-40s into the early 50s and 60s, and from then on, these appliances became, you could find one in every home. So now we have refrigerators that are keeping fresh foods fresh, like meats and vegetables and things like that. And we also have freezers that are keeping frozen foods frozen. They extend the life of foods. And of course, microwaves, which some people would say is the ultimate evil in the world. Now, I got nothing against microwave. I use it myself quite a bit, but they're now standard home appliances. So it's a lot easier for us to justify purchasing and eating processed foods because we now have ways to keep them cold and to warm them up afterwards. It's all Ansel's fault. And I say this jokingly because I kind of feel for the guy. I know that his heart was in the right place, and I'll tell you what I'm talking about in a second. But at the same time, this study that I'm going to tell you about is largely responsible for much of the really bad nutritional advice that we've been given throughout, I would say, my entire life at least. So Ancel Keys, PhD. He majored in biology and in physiology. That's one PhD from UC Berkeley and one PhD from Cambridge. So the guy knows his stuff. He was smart, he was educated, he was an actual doctor. So I'm not trying to downgrade his credentials or anything. He taught at the University of Minnesota and Harvard. And he is most famous, aside from the study, for developing K rations, which are the rations that were used in World War II. They're now known as MREs in the United States military. He's also known for popularizing the Mediterranean diet. And again, if you've not heard of the Mediterranean diet, I'm not sure what planet you're from, but you need to get your head out of the sand. Ancel Keys conducted the 7-country study between 1958 and 1964 to support his theory that dietary fat, and particularly saturated fat, was responsible for high blood cholesterol levels and therefore responsible for coronary heart disease. Now, it was a solid theory, but unfortunately, 22 countries were studied, but only the 7 that supported the theory were presented, or at least emphasized. So you've got this study that looked at data from 22 different countries, but the only 7 that supported the theory were the ones that we took the information from and we took it to heart. It was initially rejected by much of the scientific community, but it was soon adopted as the authority on the prevention of heart disease. And I will come back to that in just a minute. I'm trying to keep this as chronologically in order as I can. So following up on the heels of the 7-country study was the counterculture movement of the 1960s. You had a lot of people, getting in touch with their spiritual beings, and it's starting to create a new home life paradigm. So instead of having the standard nuclear family where you have the man of the house going out to work all day and bringing home the paycheck, and the wife staying home, caring for the home, raising the children, doing things like that, this counterculture movement shifted the way that we think of what home life should be. And now we have non-traditional families. We have people living in communes, the hippie days, and take all the stereotypes that go along with that. But it was a real thing. It actually changed our home life paradigm. On the heels of that was the women's liberation of the early 1970s, followed by the economic struggles of the late 1970s. We're talking major inflation, we're talking gas shortages, all kinds of economic issues that came up in the 1970s. These two combined, women's lib and the economic problems that were going on in the United States, took women out of the home and put them into the workforce. You now need that 2-income household just to get by. But also, women didn't want to be cooped up inside the home and, scrubbing floors and changing diapers all day. They've had this newfound freedom and they wanted to be equal like men. And that was totally, totally awesome. But it did, again, change the home dynamics. And now women are now out in the workforce. So instead of having this home where you had one income earner and one homemaker, care provider, whatever you want to call it. And so it made convenience foods, in other words, processed and preserved foods, take even more center stage inside the American home, because you got 2 income earners out all day long. They both come home. Neither one of them feel like standing in front of a hot stove or, taking things in and out of the fridge. So you got convenience foods. You pop it in the microwave, you stick it in the oven for a little while, and boom, dinner on the table. And on top of this, television came around about, let's say 15, 20, 25 years earlier. And it has also become a standard home appliance along with refrigerators and microwaves and things like that. But instead of being something that we used as a form of entertainment that we watched every once in a while, or an informative media like for news and things like that, we're now plunking ourselves down in front of this TV for hours and hours a day and shoveling these heavy processed foods into our faces. So you've got a ticking time bomb going on here. When you're eating food that's nutritionally deplete and heavy on sodium and fat and refined carbohydrates, and you're plunking your butt down on the couch in front of the television and just zoning out, well, we all seeing the results of that now. We have zombified people. We have a huge obesity epidemic, a lot of diseases of civilization, such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes and things like that. So the combination of the convenience foods taking over family life and the television taking over family interaction added to that, and if it didn't begin it. All right, government intervention. I'm going to take you back to the Ancel Keys study really quick. The first US dietary guidelines were published by the McGovern Committee in 1977, and those guidelines were based on the results of the 7-country study. Now, the theory behind it was that if you eat a lot of dietary fat, especially saturated fat, you're going to get heart disease. So the McGovern Committee looked at this study and said, okay, well, if that's the case, then we need to recommend low-fat diets for people so that they can avoid this huge epidemic of heart disease, which was killing a lot of people back then. So low-fat diets were prescribed across the board for US citizens. And you may be young enough to remember that low-fat everything dominated the store shelves from 1980 and even into the early 2000s, early part of the 21st century. I remember going to the store with my dad and seeing things like Snackwell's cookies and reduced fat salad dressing and low-fat this and diet sodas. And oh my God, the day that chips were released made with Olestra, which was an artificial synthetic fat, oh my God, I remember that. And we always had Diet Coke. We always had Diet Dr. Pepper in our fridge at home here. And my dad was very, very big on getting low-fat everything. The problem with this is that shortly following this low-fat craze, obesity became an epidemic, and everybody was totally confused. They're like, wait a second, we took all the fat out. Why are people still getting fat? Why are we still having high incidence of cardiovascular disease? Why is obesity and diabetes suddenly becoming this huge problem? Well, they didn't figure this out until, I want to say not that long ago, probably within the last 10 to 15 years, that the fat in all of these processed foods had been replaced with sugar. Why did they do that? When you take the fat out of foods, you remove the flavor, you remove that pleasant mouthfeel that you get when you eat fatty foods. Like, have you ever had a bowl of real ice cream? Oh my God, it's like heaven, right? That little film in your mouth, it's so good. And fat is satiating, it's satisfying, it helps you feel fuller because it takes longer to break down in your system. Sugar breaks down like that. And if you saw the first half of the webinar, which I highly encourage you to go back and take a look at if you haven't already, sugar breaks down very, very quickly in the body. It's meant to be an immediate fuel source, and any sugar that isn't processed pretty rapidly by the body gets eventually stored as fat. Fat does not do that. It's a much more sustainable, longer lasting source of fuel. So when food processing companies were trying to figure out, well, we took the fat out, now it's got no flavor. What do we do? Oh, I know, let's replace it with sugar. So now you're eating all this sugar. That's why obesity became an epidemic. And it started kind of falling into place. And because right around this time, the information age was born, the internet was starting to take a foothold in everybody's households and soon to follow in everybody's smartphones and tablets and things like that. The American public got wind of this and they're like, oh, sugar is the problem. It's not fat, it's sugar. So we're now getting more and more educated and learning a lot more about how fat does not make you fat, how sugar actually makes you fat. And we're starting to move more into a new way of eating. Diets like the Atkins diet, very, very low carb. Other ones like the South Beach diet, the Sugar Busters diet, and more recently the Paleo diet has become very popular. These have been called food fads. I personally follow a paleo-like dietary lifestyle, something called the Primal Lifestyle. If you want to check that out, you can Google it. It's the Primal Blueprint. It's the diet that I follow, and it's been amazingly helpful for me. I won't get into exactly what it's about. If you want to check it out, go ahead and look it up. But just to give you an idea, fortunately, we're now learning fat don't make you fat, sugar makes you fat, and we're slowly but surely starting to shift into that mindset. So want to talk to you about that food pyramid. Everybody born between 1980 and 1995 has heard of the food pyramid. It was originally introduced in 1992, and it was most recently updated in 2010, but it was a little bit confusing, so the government now has a new model known as MyPlate, which I'll talk about in just a bit. The original food pyramid, the visual representation of it was based on a Swedish model, but the guidelines that I was talking about earlier were pulled from the McGovern study. So if you remember the food pyramid, I'd love to have a graphic for it, but there's like some copyright infringement stuff, and I don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. But I'm sure you already know what I'm talking about when I say the food pyramid. If you notice, the bottom of the food pyramid is purely carbohydrate sources like grain products, like pastas, rice, chips, crackers, and things like that. And these are the things that we've been told we need to eat a lot of. You'll also see meats, you'll also see produce, the vegetables has its own section, fruits has its own section, then there's a dairy, and then up at the top, the very, very peak of the pyramid is sugars and fats, and we're told to use these sparingly. Now, the original pyramid scheme was, it was a pyramid scheme. The original food pyramid was developed by a group of nutritionists and scientists, but they had to send it to the Secretary of Agriculture's office so that it could be passed by the United States government. And unfortunately, between this group of scientists and it being released to the American public, it was hijacked by industry lobbyists. And these lobbyists fought very, very hard to include dairy in its own group. It wasn't originally given its own group. Also, processed white flour grain products were shoved into the same category as whole grain products, the ones that are a little bit healthier for you. So the American public wasn't able to make the distinction between refined grain products, things that are made with white flour and sugar, from the whole grain products that are admittedly better for you. I don't eat grains, it's my own personal choice. But if I had to choose between the two, I'd definitely go with whole grain. And these industry lobbyists also decreased the daily number of fruit and veggie servings by more than half. Originally, the total amount of fresh produce servings was recommended between 5 and 9. And now if you look at it, it's 3 to 5 servings of veggies a day and 2 to 3 servings of fruit a day. So even if you do the math, the maximum is still 8 servings of fresh produce, where originally they were recommending 5 to 9. Now you might think that one little serving isn't gonna make a big difference, but you know what? It really does in terms of nutrients and good whole foods that have good healthy calories and a lot of great nutrients to go along with it. So the final food pyramid that was released by the USDA was nothing more than a pyramid scheme, because industry lobbyists from the big beef operations, the big dairy operations, and the big grain processing operations, they put their own interests into this pyramid. They didn't put the interests of the American public forefront in this thing. They didn't really care about our health. They wanted to make sure that their agendas were pushed and that the people of the United States accepted that agenda as truth because, well, we all trust the government, don't we? Sorry, had to get a little sarcastic for a second. Stepping off my soapbox now. So another reason why the bottom of that pyramid was so grain heavy is because the US grows and exports a lot of grain products like corn, like wheat, like soy. So of course, we're gonna be told to eat a lot of them because we grow a lot of this stuff. And we have extreme surpluses of it, which I'll get to in just a bit when I talk about government subsidization. Well, we've got all of this surplus and it's food, right? So naturally, when you combine the interests of these big food processors with the corruptible government, you get served, pardon the pun, but you get served the idea that these grain products are good for them and that we need to eat a lot of them because it's good for our health. Yeah, not so much. The pyramid was revised in 2010, but it was completely confusing. Some of you might remember that it was a pyramid. It had these colored stripes going up the side of it and a little guy going upstairs to include that you need to put some daily exercise in your life as well as, you know, eating well. But it was so confusing. People were like, what the hell is this talking about? So more recently, the USDA released MyPlate. It's basically just a picture of a plate divided into 4 sections, and it's got grains, fruits, veggies, and meats or protein, as they say. And then on the side, it's got what you assume is a little glass of dairy, which most people get their dairy in the form of milk. But while MyPlate does help to simplify portion sizes, giving people a general idea of how much of each food group they're supposed to be eating, it still does not distinguish between the types of foods, meaning that it says grains, but it doesn't say whole grains or refined grains. And while it says vegetables, it doesn't distinguish whether these should be whole and organic or if they can be canned and frozen and exported and grown conventionally with all that factory farming chemical garbage. And it doesn't include fats. Oh, I wanted to pull my hair out when I saw that. You have to have fat in your diet. And if you want to know the difference between good fats and bad fats, which my plate fails to distinguish between because there is no fat category on it, go back and watch part 1 of my webinar. It will tell you what's good for you, what's bad for you, and why that is the case. Now, on to government subsidization. Government subsidization makes corn, wheat, and soy plentiful and therefore cheap. Now, subsidization in a very nutshell, general way of explaining it means that the government actually pays farmers to grow a certain amount of a certain crop or pays them not to grow a certain crop or keep it under a certain amount of a certain crop. Well, the most heavily subsidized crops in America are corn, wheat, and soy. Just to give you an idea, corn subsidies totaled $77 billion. That's billion with a B between 1995 and 2010. That's just corn by itself. Now, these subsidies were originally enacted to control prices following World War II and the subsequent overproduction. I mean, there was the baby boom. You've all heard of that. There were people everywhere. Not only that, but they were moving out of the cities and into the burgeoning idea of the suburbs. So we had people everywhere and they all had to be fed. So these farmers were just growing and growing and growing. And the government's like, wait a minute, pricing is going to get completely out of control. We have to make sure that we keep pricing down so we stabilize the market. And oh, that government intervention in economics, I don't even want to get into it. But over a couple of decades, these ideas were thrown out by the government, thanks in large part to, again, lobbyists in the 80s and 90s to make sure that these farmers were still overproducing. And so therefore their profits were rising. Even though they're overproducing, which means they have an extreme surplus, they're now telling food processing companies, they're saying, hey, guess what? We got all of this cheap stuff. You can buy it, you can process it, you can make your foods out of it, you can make ethanol with it, you can make wax candles with it. In the case of soy, you can make soy milk, you can do this, you can do that. There's all kinds of things that you can do with these grain crops, but they're mostly processed into, bet you thought I was going to say our food supply. No, a lot of these grain crops are actually processed into animal feed. And I'll talk about that in just a second when I get on to factory farming. But what you should know is that most animals are not supposed to eat grains. Keep that in mind. Just to give you an idea of what the subsidization of these crops does to our food supply, the prices of produce, meaning fruits and vegetables, increased 40% from 1985 to 2000, while soda prices dropped by 23%. Now, as most everybody knows, a lot of soda is made with high fructose corn syrup. That is like, if it's not the first ingredient, it's usually the second one right after water. So you've got these sodas being produced made out of high fructose corn syrup. Corn is being subsidized by the government, so there's a huge surplus of it. And in the meantime, fresh whole foods like, broccoli and apples, the prices of that is going up while the prices of soda and other highly processed food items and fast food is dropping. So you can see why people get the idea that it's too expensive to eat real whole foods. Health is overpriced. It's artificially overpriced thanks to this government subsidization. Now, if you don't buy into anything that I'm saying, once again, look it up, do the research. This is not conjecture, this is not theory, this is absolute fact. So here we have these food processors who are using cheap ingredients to create cheap food, which is not good for us. It's grown in nutrient-stripped soil that's been treated with pesticides and chemical fertilizers. It's then further stripped of nutrients during processing, and then it's re-fortified with chemical nutrients after that. This is madness. I mean, it's insane. And I want to apologize if I feel like I'm getting all fired up and taking this personally, but you know what? This is my health. This is the health of America. This is the health of the world. Yes, I take this personally. So based on all of that, all this artificial processing and fortification and fertilization, leads us to living in a toxic wasteland. Just to give you an idea of how toxic our food supply is, some of the side effects of common food additives are breathing difficulties. These have been linked to things like aspartame and sulfites and benzoates and a food coloring known as yellow number 5. Behavioral changes, particularly increased hyperactivity in children, things like heart damage. These additives have been linked to certain types of cancer. And even if you don't have these extreme health side effects, you get things like headaches, fatigue, memory loss, skin rash, nausea, drowsiness, heart palpitations. These are not good for us, guys. Some of the effects of pesticides include memory loss, impaired coordination, behavioral changes, reproductive problems, and fetal development problems, as well as allergies, asthma, behavioral changes, cancers, hormone disruption. Does any of this sound like it's good for us? No, it shouldn't. So why are we putting it all over our food? If you've ever seen pictures of guys wearing like full-blown chemical gear, they've got a breathing mask on, they've got a full-blown white suit, they've got rubber gloves, they've got rubber boots, and they're spraying this onto our food. This makes no sense. It's just not right. You can't imagine how not right this is. And just to give you an idea, up to 220,000 people die from pesticide poisoning every year. And this is not just those guys who are out in the field spraying our food with these chemicals. This is people eating the foods that have been sprayed with these chemicals, and then the food's been grown in this artificially chemically fertilized soil. On top of this, all these chemicals that go into the factory farming and the food processing industries causes environmental damage from runoff from factory farms. That runoff contaminates the water supply. It also leaches into the soil. So we're not just getting these chemicals from the food that we eat, we're also getting it from the water that we drink. We're getting it in the air when we breathe it in. And it's affecting animal habitats. It's affecting our ecosystems. This is not good, folks. I'm just saying, it's not good. So a little bit more on, I'm really going to drive these points home with you, so I hope that you're following me. Factory farming strips the soil of nutrients, so nutrients need to be added back to the soil with chemicals in the form of chemical fertilizers. Nutrient-poor soil makes for nutrient-poor foodstuffs just coming out of the ground before they've even been processed. And then the industrial processing strips what little nutrients there are, so we need to add these nutrients back to the food with chemicals through synthetic nutrients. Shelf-stable food, in order to stay shelf-stable, it needs to be preserved, so we're using artificial chemical preservatives. Food needs to be visually appealing, so you have food dyes that are added. Chemically, food needs to be appealing texturally, so additives are put in. Chemical additives. The food needs to taste good, so the flavors, the fats, the sweeteners are all added chemically, artificially, synthetically. Does this make sense? No! And I hope you're with me on this, and I hope you're getting just as fired up about it as I am, because it's a big deal, okay? It's a big deal. Now, here's the good news. There is a better way. There has always been a better way. You can totally avoid this whole chemical, factory farming, politics, economic, environmental garbage that comes along with the heavy processing of our food system by eating real, fresh, whole as possible, organic, local foods. Now, to do this, you want to stick to mostly plants with meat and dairy if you eat it, as a side. The reason you want to eat mostly plants is that this is where a large part of your nutrition is going to come from, meaning the nutrients, your vitamins, your minerals. These are the things that your body needs to function. If you choose to eat meat and dairy, awesome. Don't eat very much of it. I personally stick to 1, maybe 2 small servings of meat and 1, maybe 2 servings of dairy a day. I used to have meat at practically every meal and even in some of my snacks. And I used to have like 3, sometimes even 4 servings of dairy a day. I've drastically decreased that. My servings of meat are a lot smaller. My dairy is higher quality, meaning that I'm getting organic. I'm getting raw where I can get it. I get my butter is grass-fed. the yogurt that I eat is from cows not treated with growth hormone, and they're grass-fed. The half and half that I use is grass-fed. It's pasteurized, but it's grass-fed and organic. So you want to stick to the most nutrient-dense, highest quality foods you can get, especially plants. You want to get your animal products if you eat them from humane, sustainable farms. I'm talking about a farm that the animals are out in pasture, they're out on grass, they're eating grass, they're roaming free, they're not caged up, they're not fenced in and walking around in ankle deep, knee deep mud and their own feces and their own urine. They're chickens that can walk because their breasts aren't so huge that they collapse every few seconds just under their own body weight. It's really, really awful. If you want to get a better idea for just how terrible the commercial animal commercial animal feed operations are, also known as CAFOs, CAFOs. There are some really great documentaries out there. There's one called Food Inc. There's one called Food Matters. There's another one called Fed Up. You can find these on Netflix. Some of them are available on YouTube, and not all of them are available for free. But if you want to purchase them, it's totally worth it. You really, really want to get a good idea for where your food is coming from. So if you are eating animal products, make sure that you know your farmer. Just like I said in the first part of this webinar, you want to make sure they're coming from humane and sustainable farms. Eating well, it's not as expensive as you think. It really, really isn't. The reason that eating processed foods is so cheap is exactly why I explained it before, because the government is heavily subsidizing these cheap, nutritionally void, calorie heavy, over-processed, over-preserved, over-chemicalized food stuffs. I call them food-like substances. I don't even consider most of our food supply to be actual food. It's just food-like substance, meaning that you can eat it and it won't kill you immediately, but it's going to do it slowly and it's going to do it insidiously. Eating well is not expensive as you think. If you go to a local farmer's market, you'll find that the prices of the produce is pretty much comparable to your local grocery store that's growing conventional food that's been brought in from a long distance and, processed using all of these factory farming techniques and things like that. If you go to a farmer's market, you've got a farmer that came from probably within 50 miles of your front door, so it didn't have to travel very far. It's a lot more fresh, and a bonus if you can find a local organic farmer and go up to these guys and talk to them. Hey, can I drop by your farm someday? Do you guys give farm tours? Do you have a website and I can see videos of, the animals that you're raising or the crops that you're raising? Can I check this out? You want their answers to be yes, absolutely. You want your farmers to be totally open with you and disclose everything, especially their farming practices, because anybody who's doing it really right and really well, they don't have anything to hide. And even though that phrase sometimes sounds suspicious, like, well, if you don't have anything to hide, you should let us in and see everything. But it's true. Try to go to a commercial animal farm operation or a huge factory farm and say, hey, can I get a farm tour? See how they react. Watch them tell you you can't take pictures, you can't take video, you can't ask questions. Watch it. It really happens. It truly does. I keep getting off this topic. Eating well isn't as expensive as you think. If you go to a farmer's market, you're paying the farmer directly. You're often paying for the food to be shipped in, and also you're paying these big agriculture farm operations. That's where your money is going to when you get produce that's been brought in from a long distance. You're paying for the fuel cost, you're paying for the processing costs, you're paying all the salaries and hourly wages of the people who were involved in this huge factory farm operation. When you buy from a farmer's market, you're paying the farmer directly, and you're helping to support local farms. So not only are you saving a little bit of money, you're also getting great food that's healthy and hopefully organic when you can get it, and you're not paying for all this other stuff that went into the getting of the food from the field to your front door. They put it on a truck and they brought it a few miles, 50, maybe 100 at the most, and boom, great stuff on your plate. The one thing that I have noticed is more expensive when it comes to getting a good quality product is meat. Now, there's a reason for this. Growing and raising organic food is not cheap because the government doesn't make it cheap. They make it very, very hard for organic, sustainable, grass-fed, pastured, wild-caught, et cetera, et cetera. They make it very hard for these things to be affordable to most of the public. So if you're going to eat meat products, I encourage you, splurge in this area. Don't go cheap on your meat, especially your beef, because you would not believe where a lot of our meat products come from. These commercial animal farm operations, these are the horror stories you've heard about pigs being caged up in 3-foot-long pens, and they're almost never allowed to stand up. These are chickens that are shoved 4 and 5 into a cage together. Their beaks have been cut off so that they don't peck the people who are tending to them and slaughtering them. The cows that are chained up and not allowed to move more than 1 or 2 feet in front of or behind them. They can't move side to side. These horror stories are real. And I'm not trying to sensationalize anything. And yes, I am trying to shock and disgust you a little bit, because this is what's going on in our food supply. Once again, I'm not going to talk too much about this. If you want more information on CAFOs and factory farming, like I said, lots of great documentaries out there. There's a lot of really good information out there. And just understand that this is happening for real. If you can, grow your own food, especially your own fruits and vegetables, if it's possible. You can do this. You don't need a big backyard. You can do this on a windowsill. You can do this on an empty wall. Wall gardens are so cool. I really wish I could have one at my house, but I can't. And if you have kids, even better. Kids love gardening. They love watching things grow out of the soil. They love learning where food comes from. And this is a really great opportunity for you to teach your kids how to eat real, healthy, whole foods. They love digging in the dirt. They love playing with earthworms and things like that. But more than that, they love to see the results of their efforts. We seem to be raising an entire generation of children who don't care about putting work in for anything. They're totally preoccupied with cartoons and video games and who's wearing these athletes, sneakers, whatever. But if you start them young and you show them where their food comes from, that will set them up for life as far as eating well and living well on top of it. Now, if you want to get really deep into it, become a food fighter. I call myself a food fighter. This means be active, or at least informed about what's happening in the world of food and food politics, also in environmental issues, and the globalization of our food system. You probably heard that other countries, especially developing countries, especially in Southeast Asia, are starting to adopt the standard American diet, the westernized diet, and they're now having these diseases of civilization where we're planting things like fast food restaurants and exporting all of these processed foods to them. They're now starting to have the health problems that we've been having for decades. So get involved, find out about what's going on in the world as far as food, as far as the environmental impact of our foods, of our current food system, and on the globalization of our food system. Become a food fighter. Now, that does it for part 2 of the 2-part Nutrition 101 webinar series with Rockstart Wellness. If you have any questions for me about this or part 1 of the webinar, or just questions in general about health and wellness, or if you want some more information on my coaching programs, which should be coming in the next few weeks, you can email me at rockstartwellness@gmail.com. My name is Megan. I am a certified holistic health coach, and my job is to make sure that the world lives well. That's my goal. So I'm hoping that the information I presented to you today in this webinar and part 1 was informative, that it was helpful, that it opened your eyes, it woke you up a little bit, and it stirred some action. Make those changes. Find a better way. Vote with your dollars. Buy good food. Eat well, live well, and life will be great. So I'm going to switch back over to camera. And we'll stop the screen share. And we'll stop the screen share. There we go. Okay. So yeah, I pretty much wrapped it up. I want to say thank you so much for tuning in and checking out my webinars. Like I said, shoot me an email at rockstartwellness@gmail.com if you have any additional questions. And I will catch you later. Have yourself a good day. Rock on.